Hi class! Today we're going to continue with chapter 2C, which is the macromolecules. We're going to talk about carbohydrates first and then lipids. So let's get right into carbs. Carbs stands for carbohydrates. They are called carbohydrates because they contain carbon, that's the carbo part, and they contain H2O, which is water. So you're always finding CH and O as part of carbohydrates. There are different sizes and different shapes of carbohydrates, and that's what makes them all different. On here you can see at the top where it says carbs. We tend to think about things like pasta, rice, things like that, bread. When we think about carbs, those are complex carbs, but there are also simple carbs that are just little sugars. So down here on this picture, it's showing you all carbohydrates are made of these little hexagons that are the symbol for sugars, but they're all different sizes of them. All right, so carbohydrates. They are made of CH and O. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are the only elements you're going to find in carbohydrates. There's a couple little exceptions, but in general, that's all you're finding. So see in the picture down here at the bottom, you see a bunch of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. What is the function of carbohydrates? They have two main functions in all living things, not just in humans. They store energy. It's a good place. Not really a place. They're good molecules for all kinds of organisms to take their excess sugars and store them. And they are for structure. They actually physically make up parts of different organisms. So that's the structure. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Examples are starch and sugars. You've heard of both of these things, lactose, glucose, fructose. These are all examples of specific sugars. Over here, carbohydrates can be simple, which just means small. And you can see the different names of sugars down here. Monosaccharides are one ring, disaccharides are two rings. So here's an example of a disaccharide at the bottom. Polysaccharides are many of these sugars in chains, and we'll talk about those as well. We already talked about the fact that all macromolecules have monomers and polymers, so let's talk about those for carbohydrates specifically. The monomer for carbohydrates is a monosaccharide. Mono means one. All right, so there's one mono, and saccharide is sugar. So each of these rings is a monosaccharide, a single sugar. All right, so this is the simplest version of carbohydrates. But then we're going to take these monomers and we're going to put them into chains called polymers. And you can see that they still get that hexagon type shape. That hexagon forever in biology symbolizes a sugar. So you can see these are chains of sugars that are twisted up a little bit and a little bit branched. So examples here, glucose, fructose, galactose, deoxyribose, ribose. You can write any of those. Polysaccharides are many, poly means many, like polymer, polysaccharide, many sugars. Examples of that are starch, which is what's shown here, two different versions of starch. Cellulose is another one, glycogen. You can put either of those. Here are some examples of polysaccharides. And you can see it's all those hexagon shapes, but they're doing different things. That's what makes all these different complex carbohydrates act differently in the body or in any living thing, is their structure. So you can see here, we have starch, that's those sugars in what they call a helix. Here's a branched helix of glycogen. Cellulose has straight chains, and then another one called chitin that also has straight chains, but there's some groups added on that make it function differently. So let's talk about those four polysaccharides. The first one we're going to talk about is glycogen. Glycogen is a molecule where animals store their extra sugar, animals including humans. Anytime that you eat, you take some of the extra sugars that you ate and you make them into this molecule called glycogen that you store for later use. You don't eat all the time, but you have to have energy all the time. So you have to store some of it to use between meals. This is what we do with glycogen. We store it in our liver and muscle cells. Those are places that it's extremely essential that we always have energy available. So down here at the bottom, you can see these little dark pieces. Those little dark pieces are called glycogen granules, and they are grains that are made of this branchy sugar chain. All right, so you can see that each of these little circles represents a monosaccharide. It's definitely a polysaccharide, many sugars in a chain, and it's very twisty and branchy. All right, so this is glycogen. It is a glucose chain, and it will be broken down for later use. Next is still going to be a storage polysaccharide, but it is going to be for plants. So plants store their excess sugars in a little bit of a different molecule that's called starch. You probably have all heard of starch. Here's a potato. That's where we find a lot of starch. Rice, grains, things like that. Plants produce a lot of sugars in photosynthesis. They don't need all those sugars to use right away. So they will put them into these long helical chains, and then that's twisty helical chains. And then this is how they store their sugars for later use. We take them from them and we use them for our own use as well. Here's some plant cells up in this corner, and you could see that there are these purple blobs. Those are starch granules or starch grains that wait around there until the plant needs the excess sugars, and then they can use them. Or we harvest them and we use them for ourselves. So potatoes, bread, because it comes from wheat, and pasta as well. That's starch, storage polysaccharide in plants. Next is cellulose. Cellulose is also found in plants, but this time it's not for storage, it's for structure. All right, a structural polysaccharide means that part of the organism is actually made of it. And with cellulose, it's the plant cell wall. Every plant has a cell wall. They are necessary, they are very tough, they give that plant its structure. All right, the outside of every plant cell is made of cellulose. You can see at the bottom that this cellulose is a straight chain. Before we saw a whole bunch of twisty branchy chains, cellulose has a different structure where it's in these straight chains. And then those chains go together into like rope, and then those ropes go together, and those ropes go together, and then they weave together to make that cell wall. Because it's a straight chain, we don't have enzymes to break this down, so we actually can't get energy from this. In our diets, what we do get, though, is an important molecule or an important substance, and that is fiber. You all have heard about fiber in your diet and how it's good for you. You're getting that every time you eat any kind of a plant, because every single cell wall is made out of it. It helps the body to move food through and to process it better. It is a really important part of your diet. Even though we don't use it for energy, it still is important for our use. That is cellulose. Our last one that we're going to talk about is chitin. Chitin is also structural, which means it's actually making up a part of the organism. In this case, we're looking at fungi. That's the kind of organism that this is in, and also insects and crustaceans. Chitin is, again, a long chain, and it tends to be straight. You could see it has these extra little parts over to the side. This changes the structure of it and also its properties. So chitin acts differently from cellulose, even though it's still a straight chain. Here are some mushrooms. The cell walls here are made of this. This is what gives mushrooms and mold and things like that their texture. It's a different kind of a texture than you would find with cellulose cell walls, so chitin cell walls. Also, the exoskeletons of insects and crustaceans. It is reinforced here with some extra elements besides CH and O that are going to make it very tough. Some humans can digest this. In other humans, it just acts like another source of fiber. Here we are with another recap. These are the four we just talked about: starch, glycogen, cellulose, and chitin. All right, now let's talk about lipids. Lipids are also known as fats or oils. You can see some pictures here on the slide of those things. They are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which we've already seen, but we are also, to one group of lipids, going to add phosphorus. So we'll see that in a little bit. Functions of lipids: they store energy in the body. It's a very important function that they have. They also can provide insulation for organisms. Cell membranes are made up of this. We're going to do a whole chapter about cell membranes. That's a really important thing that lipids do, is make up the cell membrane of every single cell that exists. They also are cell messengers. Some groups of these send messages around the body telling different parts what to do. The one thing that all lipids do have in common is that they are hydrophobic. You can see the word there at the bottom. Hydrophobic means water-fearing. Hydro is water, phobic is fearing. All lipids repel water. They don't dissolve in water. They don't want to be near water. You know this. Oil and water, things like that. You wax your car to keep the water off of it. These are nonpolar. They don't have any charges. There's nothing for them to interact with on the water with its charges. So they do not want to be together. See that middle picture there? I'm sorry, we just can't be together. Is it because I'm fat? Yes, it's because you're afat, because you're nonpolar, and they do not attract to one another. All right, so 2 of the 3 kinds of lipids that we're going to talk about do have fatty acids. There is not one common monomer that all lipids have in common. And carbohydrates, remember, it was the monosaccharides. They do all have that. Lipids, 2 of the 3 kinds have fatty acids, so this is as close to a monomer as we're going to get. What is a fatty acid? A fatty acid is a long hydrocarbon chain. What the heck's a hydrocarbon? Hydrocarbons are made of hydrogen and carbon. You can see them here, right? So here's the carbon and here's the hydrogen. Long hydrocarbon chains. And this one's not too long. They can be much longer than this. They do have an acid group on the end, which is why they're called fatty acids. These are a major part of most lipids, 2 of the 3 kinds. And we're going to talk a lot more about fatty acids. Reminder at the bottom, they don't really have a polymer. They're not really polymers. They're not chains of anything, but they are still big molecules. They're still made by dehydration synthesis and broken down by hydrolysis. So they do follow most of the rules of macromolecules. So there are different types of fatty acids. They can be saturated or unsaturated, and you can see those in the pictures. Saturated fatty acids are called fats, and they are solid at room temperature. They contain all single bonds. They are a straight chain of carbon, and they are full of hydrogen. That's what saturated means. Saturated means that you're full of something. So let's look at this top example. This is a saturated fatty acid. Straight chain, see the carbons go right in a row, and there's hydrogens all surrounding this main portion. This is full of hydrogens, single bond, straight chain. This makes it a solid at room temperature because these nice straight chains can stack on top of each other very easily. Right, so if you have a whole bunch of them in there stacking up, they can stack up and make a lovely stick of butter. Right. The opposite of that is an unsaturated fat. These make oils at room temperature. That is because, you can see here, they call this kinked. They're not a straight chain. So if you have a thing that's shaped like this and another one shaped like that, they are not making a nice straight pile. So since they're all wacky, they cannot make a solid at room temperature. They make an oil or a liquid. They have to have double bonds. That's what makes them get these little kinks or bends in them, is the double bond between carbons. When you have a double bond between carbons, you also lose the hydrogens. So remember, in the saturated, it was full. If something is saturated, it's full of something. This is full of hydrogens. Down here, you might notice, all of a sudden there are spaces where there are no hydrogens. That is why this is called unsaturated. It's not full. Right? Those kinks or bends make it have a different kind of a shape. Down here at the bottom, you could see some more pictures of this. These are saturated, more straight lines, whereas these ones are all bending around. These are unsaturated fats. Hydrogenation is a process that people have invented to try to take unsaturated oils, there it is right there, unsaturated oils. So we're looking at these ones that are kinked with a double bond in them. This is an unsaturated oil right here. And these tend to spoil. So what people figured out that they wanted to try to do is make food last longer. And to do that, they needed to change these oils into fats. So they invented this process called hydrogenation, where basically you throw hydrogen at these molecules and you hope to break the double bond and turn them into, down here, this, hopefully you can recognize that this is a saturated fat, full of hydrogen, straight chain. They were trying to make these liquids become solids, and they will last longer in this state. This worked, and there's in all kinds of different products now contain these saturated fats that are made by hydrogenation. This is good for making long-lasting foods, but it's really kind of bad for the body. Unsaturated fats are much more healthy than saturated fats. But even worse than the saturated fats that were produced in this process, we also got another kind of fat called the trans fat. Trans fats do not exist in nature, so our body has no idea what to do with them when we take them in. They're in a lot of different kinds of foods. You can see them on the labels if you look at food labels. Trans fats are not something that you want to be dealing with. Your body doesn't know what to do with them, so it just sort of drops it off in arteries and places like that and can lead to heart disease. So you do want to try to avoid this. The trans does have a chemistry basis. We're not really worried about that here, but just understand that it's a different form of a fat that our body cannot break down. All right, so there are three groups of lipids that we're going to talk about. The first one are called triglycerides, and we categorize them as fats or oils, and they function in energy storage in the body. They're called triglycerides because they're made of three fatty acids. You can see three fatty acids right here. This is the three fatty acid part. That's the tri of triglyceride. And then the glyceride part comes from the molecule that's the backbone where they all attach on. That's called glycerol. You have some pictures on your notes. You're going to be labeling them as glycerol and three fatty acids. The pictures on this slide are just a few different ways to represent what a triglyceride looks like. Right? But all of them have in common the glycerol backbone. You see that here. And in this part, this one is a different kind of a model. That's the glycerol backbone there. And then attached onto each of the three carbons, see this has three carbons in it? Each of those three carbons then is going to have a fatty acid tail or a fatty acid chain sticking off of there. This is a triglyceride. And this is how your body stores energy when you take in more food or more calories than you need. They store them as fats. These fatty acids, we talked about this already, can be different. Down here on this picture, this is showing one of them is saturated, and then these two down here are unsaturated, not full. They're missing hydrogens, and they have those double bonds. So they can have different properties. The next type of lipid are phospholipids. They are similar to triglycerides in that they have this glycerol backbone and some fatty acid tails, like we saw before. But on their third carbon, instead of having another fatty acid, they have what's called a phosphate group. So we will usually look at a phospholipid like this with a head that is polar or hydrophilic. This head part likes water, and the fatty acid tails we already talked about don't like water. This is where the phosphorus comes in, and it creates charges with its oxygens and other molecules and atoms that are attached on. So this is a really important part of cell membranes. That's the function. And it is still made of fatty acids, but it has this phosphate group on that changes its structure and its function as well. And you can see here a cell membrane with a phospholipid bilayer. We'll talk a lot more about that one later. Here's a comparison between a triglyceride and a phospholipid. You can see that their structure is very much the same. The only difference is that we're having the phosphate head here, which changes the properties of a phospholipid. Our last group of lipids are the steroids. Steroids function as hormones, chemical messengers that travel around in your blood and tell different body parts what to do. Steroids are not the only kind of, when you say steroids, you might think, oh, I'm going to take steroids to get big muscles. Okay, that is a type of steroid, but there are lots of different steroids. The only thing that all steroids have in common is that they have these four rings in all these pictures. You can see the four rings of carbon that are all stuck together. That is the characteristic structure of a steroid, is four carbon and hydrogen rings that are all stuck together. There are a lot of really important steroids. Cholesterol is a steroid. You do need cholesterol in your body. You probably think it's bad, and there are bad aspects to it, but it is needed for your body. Estrogen and testosterone are also steroids. The steroids that work to build up muscle are related to testosterone. All right, but all of these things here are steroids, and they function as hormones or chemical messengers in the body. So nutritionally, what we would call cholesterol is not actually cholesterol. It is what's called a lipoprotein. You might have heard of two types of cholesterol, good and bad. There are two types of what we would call cholesterol. It's not the actual steroid cholesterol. It's this ball of fat and protein is what we're looking at. These are lipoproteins. It is this spherical structure that carries cholesterol and fats around in the blood. This is the purpose of it. Fats should not be able to go in your blood because they hate water and your blood is based on water. But they can travel around in these, I like to think of them sort of like taxi cabs or buses. Their job is to pick up fats and cholesterol and any kind of lipid and transport it through the blood around the body. They're called lipoproteins. And there are two kinds of lipoproteins. One is called low-density lipoprotein, or an LDL. This is what we call bad cholesterol. We call it bad cholesterol because when it picks up cholesterol and fats, it actually deposits it in the arteries. You do not want fats deposited in your arteries. LDL, this little bad devil guy here, he deposits all these fats and things in your arteries, and it causes plaque and cardiovascular disease. We don't like LDL. The other one is very similar to this, but it's called HDL. It is high density lipoprotein. I think of it as heavenly or as wearing a halo to remember that it's the good one. Good cholesterol still transports fats in your blood, which is an essential thing. You need that to happen. But instead, HDL will take those extra lipids to the liver where they get broken down and you get rid of them. This is the one that you want. So when they talk about lowering cholesterol as a good thing, it's the LDL that you really want to lower. HDLs are actually very good for you. All right, so that's it for lipids. That was part of 2C, part of the macromolecules. So now we've done carbohydrates and lipids. I hope you learned something.